What do you get when you combine Jamaican reggae with Latin urban pop? I'll give you a hint. Reggaeton. That's right, in this video we're gonna deconstruct a mix featuring Verano Bros from Italy and Yet Gadbe from Cuba. My name is Alex from California and you've tuned in to Alex Pro Mix. Vámonos! Hey everyone and welcome to Alex Pro Mix, where you'll learn everything you need to know about mixing and mastering to help you sound your best. This channel was created with you, the viewer, in mind. This channel is all about you and I'm gonna give you guys a pathway to make your lives easier. In this video, I'm gonna walk you guys through a mix deconstruction of a reggaeton track. Without further ado, let's check out what the track sounds like. Here we go.
Como que no se anda sola, anda quédate un poquito más. No me digas que ahora tienes dudas. Yo sé que no soy perfecto, ay, yo sé que no soy lo que buscabas. Yo sé que no soy tu galán de novela ni tu príncipe azul, pero allá tú, yo no te lo voy a negar. Tú sabes que me gustas, pero pierdes si te vas.
Just a little background here about this song. I was contacted by Verano Bros from Italy. This is a two-team production. These guys are legit. When I was contacted by them, they needed help with just doing some of the mixing and the mastering for this project and another one. This one in particular, I'm very happy about. And if you've been watching any of my videos for the past years, you'll notice that I always use Pro Tools, or sometimes I'll use Studio One. And if you're watching this for the first time, you're wondering, Alex, what are you doing using Logic Pro X? There's a story behind that. At the tail end of 2018, I had this killer mix template that I would use for all my projects in Pro Tools. I mean, this thing was like pre-baked. All I had to do was drag in the files, assign them to the right channels, hit play, and the mix was like 70% done. After I finished an album called My Offering, I got rid of that template because I felt that everything that I was producing was sounding the same. And what I did is I hit the reset button, I unplugged Pro Tools, I got rid of my mix template, I jumped into Logic, never having using Logic before. I figured it out, and I needed to prove to myself that, hey, if I'm a competent mixing engineer, it doesn't matter what tools I have, whether it's analog, whether it's digital, whether it's Cubase, whether it's Logic, it doesn't matter. If I can reproduce good results every time, then let me jump into a different DAW. And that's exactly what I did. So when Verano Bros contacted me, I was just getting my feet wet with Logic, and this was gonna be a big project. So I'm like, do I really wanna do it or not? And I went all in. As you can see, this session is really large. We've got a ton of tracks on here. We've got drum groups, we got bass groups, plugs, which are all the keys, live instruments, which are like the brass, horns, flutes. We have sound effects. We have lead vocal tracks. Let's keep going. We have main vocal doubles, even though it's just one guy primarily singing. We got chorus tracks, and then everything gets summed up into these groups or buses: instrument, vocals, some reverb returns, and then the master track. I just took a risk, I encourage you guys to do the same. Be competent about what you do, but don't get stuck using the same tools over and over. If you feel you've reached a plateau, then switch it up. Hit the reset button, throw out your template, try something completely different than you. All right, so let's check out what we actually have going on in this session. And for a lot of you guys who don't really know what reggaeton is all about, the thing about reggaeton music is that it's really driven by the beat, which is the drums and the bass, and the melody comes from the vocals. Everything else just kind of supports that, and such is the case here. But let's start with the drums, because the drums is really the beat and the rhythm of the music. So I'll take a chorus section, which is this right here, and let's solo the drums. Here we go. All these drums, all these individual drums are being summed into a stereo channel, all right, which is this track right here. So really what I want to pay attention to is what we're doing on that drum group. First up is the BX console. This is a emulation of the solid state logic, the SSL 4000E. There are many different SSL plugins out there from Waves, Softtube, and other companies. The purpose here was to basically brighten up the track and make it a little bit more clear sounding. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna bypass all the plugins, all right? And we're gonna listen to the EQ, we're gonna turn it off, we're gonna bring it on. Here we go. So again, very minor stuff, really just kind of cleaning up the audio. Here with the bell curve, we're boosting up around 10K. That's just giving it a little bit of brightness on the top. You know, a lot of times when I'm thinking about EQs, and this is very important, I want you guys to understand this. All right, let's think about an EQ. An EQ is always found in car stereos, on your phone, on your stereo controls, and typically you have bass and treble, right? So think of this as a bass and treble knob with 2 additional bands in the middle. And if you want something to sound brighter, you're going to turn up the treble. If you want something to sound boomier or heavier or more weight, you're going to turn up the bass. But think beyond that. Sometimes don't use EQ to make things brighter. Use EQ to bring out the detail in certain elements of the mix. So think about that. That's exactly what we're doing here with the bell. Even though we're making it slightly brighter by about 2 dB, which is really not much, my attempt is to bring out more of that detail from the kick and the percussion elements. Cool? We're not using any compression, and in fact, you'll learn this about me later, but I'm not a fan of compression. I come from the school of thought that, as Bruce Swedien used to say, compression is for kids. I'll explain that backstory in another video. Next up is the Black Box HG2. Instead of using compression, because compression can make things sound smaller, I like to use saturation. Saturation allows me to give more density to the drums. So we're getting clarity from the EQ, we're getting detail from the EQ, but now we're adding density or weight to the drums. We have a mix knob here on the top right, and this is set to about 29%. If I turn this up to 100%, you're gonna hear what the plugin is doing, but I'm gonna dial that back using the mix knob. Here we go. Now, one thing I'll mention, and just to kind of give you guys a studio tour here, we're using 2 sets of studio monitors. We're using our big, large format monitors, which are full range. These are Bauer & Wilkins 801 Series 1. These are as old as I am. If you can guess that number, leave it on the chat below. And then I'm using the Aural Tones. Both of these are passive speakers. That means I have to use an amp and wire everything and everything. But the key thing is that I mostly use the Aural Tones when I'm mixing, and when I turn this on 100%, I feel that kick pushing air, and I like that. But anyways, we're using 29% here on the mix. Let's move on to the next plugin. Next up is a limiter. The limiter is going to catch just the peaks of those hard transients of the drums. We're softening that up so that later on down the line, we're making everything louder and pushing it into the final limiter. You know, that limiter is not working too hard. So we're using limiter at different stages of the mix so that the final brick wall limiter at the end of our mix is not doing so much work. Here we go. Okay, and after the limiter, we're using more EQ. And again, we're doing some very surgical cuts. With the BX Digital, we're cutting these resonant frequencies way down at the bottom because later when I add the bass, it's conflicting. The kick is conflicting with the bass line. We're also using the metric halo. Again, same thing, just very sharp resonant frequencies that get in the way. So EQ, EQ, and then more EQ. This EQ is not doing the same thing as the surgical EQs. The Pultec is basically just enhancing the low end, which is here. We're boosting 100, and then we're also cutting that frequency, which is actually above that. It's called a reciprocal curve. And then lastly, we're using a clipper, and this clipper is very important, especially in rap and trap and modern pop urban types of music. The clipper, this is kind of a thing that we're accustomed to now. This is what I call the FL Studio Producer era, which is you push that kick into the limiter and you get this massive sound, and you kind of, it rounds off the transients. And so being able to use a clipper here on the drums allows me to soften the transients, similar to the limiter that we were using earlier. A limiter is going to be more transparent. The clipper is going to round that off a bit. So it's going to give it a little bit more crunch and punch. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and hide everything. And let's hear the before and after on the drums with all the plugins. Here we go. This is before. And after. Now the magic happens when you hear in context of the mix. So I'm going to turn off all these plugins and you're going to hear how the drums are struggling to punch and hit in the mix of all the other instruments. Here we go. Check it out. So with all the processing engaged, the punch has more definition, it hits harder, it's clearer, it's right there. It's not necessarily like louder, it's just more defined, right? And think about that. We did not use compression. We didn't use compression. We used EQ, saturation, more EQ, more EQ, more EQ, more EQ, more EQ, and then, you know, a clipper at the end to kind of soften out those hard edges. So be attentive to that. All right, let's check out what else we have here. So we got that, we got the drums, we got the bass. The bass is very important because here's the thing, and that's why I like to mix on these little small speakers, because especially with this type of music, you're either going to have a bass that's melodic, that's going to be everything above 100 hertz, or you're going to have a sub bass that's going to sit in the 60 hertz, 50 hertz underneath the drums. And you have to make a decision. All right, do I want like a heavy kick, or do I want a punchy kick that's not going to have a lot of low end on it? In this case, the punchy kick worked out. That's why I was carving out those frequencies. So on the bass track, we're taking the bass line and we're basically duplicating it. And we're using one bass line or bass track to have the melody heard on these small speakers. But we're using the other bass as a sub bass to really fill out that low end. And that's what I'm going to hear on the large speakers. So it's the same bass line, but I've cut it and duplicated it in 2 tracks. So here's the top bass line right here. And this is the sub bass line. So let me show you how I accomplished that. On the high bass line, the one that I want to sound melodic, I'm using Logic's Vintage Graphic EQ. And I gotta say, when I was learning Logic, those 3 or 4 weeks, and figuring out what it was all about, I dove in, man. I mean, you know, I was like, these are like new plugins, and I know how to use an EQ, so let me just try it out. I was really impressed with this. This is basically an API graphic style of EQ. Going through Saturn. Saturn is going to be your best friend whenever you want things to cut through on small speakers, on iPhones, on Alexa. So using Saturn gives you saturation. It allows you to hear those bass lines into small speakers. And opposite of that, for the sub-low bass, there's this trick that I have, which is basically you use saturation just on the sub-low frequencies, which is everything here below this frequency. I think that's like 80 or something. So I'm driving distortion with these two knobs so that the low end is just really heavy and really weighty, all right? Followed up by low end EQ. I'm boosting 60 hertz, that's a lot of low end. And followed up by a compressor that's really just squeezing that into place. So let me play that for you. You guys can see the settings and how the plugins are behaving. Here we go, check it out. Now, one thing I'll mention about mixing bass and drums in any pop genre, and I've encountered this a lot, which is there's a very definitive location balance-wise where the drums and the bass need to sit in order for it to just be locked in perfect. What I mean by that is that I spent a lot of time balancing and listening for that relationship between the drums and the bass. I once I think I have it right, I'll switch speakers, I'll switch again, I'll export it, I'll listen to it on my phone, I'll listen to it in the car, because once you have that drum bass relationship right, man, the whole mix just falls into place. But when the bass and the drums are not quite right, some notes stick out, some notes disappear, it's really, really frustrating. Key thing on mixing low end, spend time. Spend time with it. Cool, so we got drums, we got bass. All right, these guys are summed up. And then we have some more instruments. But before we jump into the instruments, let's go to our star, which is Yet Garbe, all right? Phenomenal voice, man. I mean, just a lot of flavor here, you know what I mean? So let's go ahead and take everything off solo and find the location here in the song where we have the vocals. So the vocal really is just a primary lead voice. It was pre-tuned before I got it. And, his voice is just really, really nice and really enjoyable to mix. So here on the chorus, there's not a lot going on. You have the main voice, which is here. You have a vocal double, and then you have the choir doubles, which is basically just left and right. So let's listen to those separately. All right, here we go. So we're going to check out the lead. This is the lead. All right, so that's the call. This is the response. Tú sabes que me gustas. Slightly panned left and right. And everything has echo because you got to have a lot of echo just floating around the background with reverbs and stuff like that. This is the main double. So these have been comped. And what I mean by that is that they were edited and they were just mixed down into a stereo file, makes my life easier. Cool? All right, so let's listen to the voice together without any of the instruments, listening to the core three, what I call the core three are drums, bass, and vocals. We'll go ahead and just get rid of these live instruments, live sound effects, mute the plugs, 1, 2, 3, boom, boom, boom. Let's hear the music with just the drums, the bass, and the vocals. Here we go.
Tienes problema y yo no, que yo estoy pa' todo y tú no. Dime si le damos, si metemos mano, donde no chequeamos y uno. Dime cuál es la vuelta más, actívate con la sativa, deja ya la.
That's the song. Everything else is just kind of ornaments, ear candy, the chords, the stabs, the sound effects. That right there is the song. Drums, bass, vocals. You get those three elements right on a pop genre music, man. You are on fire. you're like 90% there, all right? So let's dive in and see what we used on the lead vocal. So lead vocals broken up into separate tracks. I like to do that because on verse 1, where there's no music, I want to process it a certain way. Verse 2, where the music drops out into like this filtered, I want to process it differently. Verse 2B, or the pre-chorus, where the music is different, I want to process it differently. So that's why I like to split out the vocal tracks. Even though there's one singer, doesn't mean you have to keep it on one track. Duplicate it across different tracks, distribute it so that you can process it. So let's check out verse number 2, which is right here. And let's find where the lead vocal is, which is right over here. All right, cool. So this is called the vocal bridge, wrongly labeled. And we're using saturation. Okay, so no surprises there, no compression. We're using saturation. Saturation at 100% sounds like this.
Tú tienes problemas y ya no, que yo estoy pa' todo y tú no. Dime si le damos, si metemos mano, donde no chequeamos y uno. Dime cuál es la vuelta más, actívate con la...
It really just pushes the voice out in front of the speakers. And we had that dialed, I can't recall. Oh, here we go. We have an undo button. Thank you, Dirk. Thank you for the undo button on this plugin. Next up, we're using a graphic EQ. Barely touching this thing. I mean, look at this. Scooping out a little bit of 300. 300 hertz is usually that part in the voice where it kind of builds up and gets a little bit muddy, especially if it's like a home recording. I don't know how this was recorded, but it sounds great. And then we're adding 4K, 9.5, and 19K. We're not making the voice brighter. Again, we're bringing out the detail in the voice. And that's why we're using these EQ settings. This is before.
Tú tienes problemas y ya no, que yo estoy pa' todo y tú no. Dime si le damos, si metemos mano, donde no chequeamos y uno. Dime cuál.
So we're slightly, adjusting the voice to fit. The heavy processing is not done on the individual channels. All the individual channels are going to a vocal group, which is this guy right here. And this is where all the heavy processing is done. So let me give you guys my secrets here. First off, a de-esser. The de-esser, similar to a limiter, is going to just catch those peaks. It's going to shave it off so that nothing is coming out too strong, all right?
Tú tienes problemas y ya no, que yo estoy pa' todo y tú no. Dime si le damos, si metemos mano, donde no chequeamos y uno. Dime cuál es la vuelta más, actívate.
And this is a dual band de-esser, so that means it's catching two separate frequencies. They're slightly coming on 1 or 3 dB, very gentle. That's followed up by a limiter, as I mentioned. It's just catching the peaks, making sure everything's in place. And then that goes into auto-tune. So even though there was some tuning done on the voice, it still needed to be a little bit heavier. And you have to communicate with the producer because, you don't want to ruin their vision of the mix. A good engineer can take an idea of a producer and enhance it. An amateur engineer, what I used to do when I started out was try to reinvent the wheel. And that's how you lose a lot of customers. So don't do that. So we're using auto-tune to just do that. And then the Mag EQ, again, not so much to make the voice brighter, is bringing up a little bit of the air using here the 20K boost at 8 dB, which is a lot. But really, it's that sense of just having more detail in the voice. And then lastly, a plugin. This is my secret weapon. I'll leave that till last. So let's hear that before and after, all right? This is before, all the plugins.
Tú tienes problemas y ya no, que yo estoy pa' todo y tú no. Dime si le damos, si metemos mano, donde no chequeamos y uno. Dime cuál es la vuelta más, actívate con la sativa, deja ya la bobería por debajo y baja con el dembow. Que tú andas solo y yo también, mira, tú estás como un tren, déjame poner.
So with all the plugins engaged, you hear more of the throat, you hear more of the brightness. I don't want to say brightness, I want to say more detail. You hear more of the detail of the voice, more detail of his raspiness, of just the character and the nature of his voice. So, what is my secret weapon? Well, this is my secret weapon right here. A lot of times when I get deep into mixing and you're dealing with a lot of tracks and you bring in the piano and you bring in the sound effects and everything's fighting for that mid-range, again, trusty auto tones, you can hear only mid-range, you hear no bass and no super highs. But all the mid-range is just fighting for that attention. This allows me, this is called dynamic equalizer. This allows me to smooth out that harshness on the voice, especially as it gets louder. And so with all the plugins prior to this, I'm kind of boosting, with the saturation with the EQ. But with this one, I am smoothing that mid-range out. And in fact, I'll solo that for you guys so you can hear that.
Tú tienes problemas ya no, que yo estoy pa' todo y tú no. Dime si le damos, si metemos mano, donde no chequeamos uno. Dime cuál es.
So it's making the voice, the mid-range dance, so that when he's just going a little bit stronger, it's just smoothing that out so that it sounds pleasant, it's not piercing. What I want to jump into though is the instruments. Now that we've defined our core 3 elements in the mix, which are drums, bass, and vocals, let's start bringing in all the fun stuff, which are the plucks, the chords, the horns, the melody, the stabs, the sound effects, and everything else. And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, all right? The plucks are basically made up of 4 different tracks, plucks 1, 2, 3, and 4. And apparently there's a 5th pluck over here, which happens once in the intro, in the bridge, and on the outro. This is what it sounds like in the intro. That's pluck 5 and pluck 1. So that's more like a Rhodes, and then you have the pluck above. Pluck number 2 on the verse. It's a little bit more grabby. Pluck number 3, which happens on the pre-chorus. It's what I like to call tines, kind of like an 80s electric piano. And plug number 4, you got this in. So all together, you have these 5 plugs. They come in at different times. As you can see, they're layered. I mean, the production on this was brilliantly well thought out. And so let's hear the verse, pre-chorus, and chorus. Here we go. As the listener is taken through the progression of the song, through the arrangement, all these little layers start unveiling. The plucks, there's not a lot going on there except for the BX limiter just catching the peaks, and the 2BQ, which is just kind of boosting 5K just to kind of make things a little bit more clear, all right? Again, no compression. I want to know in your comments below, how much compression do you use and why? And I'll leave it at that. Next up is the live instruments. And the live instruments are comprised of the brass gain, which is basically a stab, and then you have the flute, which happens in the chorus, which is right here. So that melody corresponds to the call and response on the voice. Let's check it out. I'll play those together.
Tú sabes que me gustas.
So let's play everything together now. We're going to play all the instruments, the voice, and the drums and the bass. Here we go. Check it out.
Allá tú, yo no te lo voy a negar. Tú sabes que me gustas, pero pierdes si te vas. Cuando te vea tú, yo no te lo voy a negar. Tú sabes que me gustas, pero pierdes si te vas. Cuando te vea, tú tienes problemas.
All right, the last part of this arrangement are the sound effects, which are very important. And this is what I call the vocal chop. Check it out. That's a hook within itself. And there's also a thing that I created called vocal effects print. Now, this is the territory where once you have the core elements of the mix done, once you have your bass in place, you have your drums in place, you have your vocal in place, you're using some reverb and ping pong delay to just kind of make it dance, you have your plucks in place, everything is sitting right. You can stop there. You can send that file to the producer and say, hey, look, I mixed your song. And they can hear it and say, yeah, it sounds better. Or you can do what I like to do, which is go the extra mile. This is what I call the territory of creative mixing. Creative mixing is when you take your musical personality and you apply it to the song. So what you're doing is you are providing something new and different back to the producer with his song. And if they like it, man, it's a win-win. Trust me. I love creative mixing. This is part of my creative mixing process here. This track is called the Vocal Effects Print. I think I've already printed that, but basically what I did is I took these chants and shouts that were ad-libs. They were just regular ad-libs. And I really dove into some just weird plugin like this stuff. I mean, I don't understand what this does, all right? I just found a preset which is called 4th beat something. And, I just started twisting some parameters. And basically what I wanted to create was like this random echoes, delays, panning. I wanted to create this like atmosphere for the ad-lib to dance in. And that's what happened with this track. That's followed by a EQ, just filtering out the highs and the lows and scooping out the mids so that it doesn't get in the way of the lead voice, which is really important. And then just a limiter to make sure that it's in place. So let me play this for you and you guys can hear what that sounds like, all right? And this is, the heavy lifting is done by this plugin, which is called Unfiltered Audio Spec Ops. Yeah, so as you guys can hear, it's just weird. It's just like it echoes and then it pitches up and then it kind of randomly comes down and it just adds a lot of cool flavor to the song, I think. So much better than just using a ping pong delay and leaving it static. All right, so that's one thing I did. Other times when I'm doing creative mixing, I'll actually pitch the voice down. I'll create breaks in the song that weren't there. It just really matters on the song. And there's no formula to it. All I got to say is that once you're competent with mixing and mastering, once you're competent with working with clients and working with producers and understanding what they want, then use your musical personality, insert that into the music to make it better. And I think that's where a lot of engineers don't really talk about on YouTube. And that's what I hope to achieve and that you guys can learn on my channel here. Let me know in your feedback below what that means for you. In the meantime, let's go ahead and finish off this mix. Let's check out what we did on the mix bus to make this track sound super hot and super loud. All right, let's go. Okay, so at the very end we have, which is the master channel, which is right here. And we got a couple things going on. First of all, gain staging. I can't talk enough about gain staging. It's so important. Once you have the gain structure right at the beginning of the song and you're hitting a certain VU meter, in fact, I like to use 2 sets of VU meters. I like to use the left pair of VU meters. These days I calibrate that to minus 16 dB full scale when mixing. So my kick and my bass are hitting the VU meter around 0 at the loudest parts. And I use the right pair of my VU meters calibrated at minus 10 dB full scale for mastering, which means that 1, 2, 3 would be minus 9, minus 8, minus 7 if I do the math, which means in the hot zone, I'm getting the mix loud and the master loud. Once I have my gain structure right, then I start messing around with these plugins. So before the ML4000, the track is nice, it's balanced, everything's in the right place. But with the ML4000, it just becomes more punchy, more dynamic. It brings it more to life. That's followed TR5 Classic Clipper, which is what we're trying to achieve is to achieve that whole FL Studio producer kick in your face, super punchy sound, right? So we're increasing the gain a lot. So this is where it starts getting really loud, all right? So watch your ears, watch your speakers, turn that down a little bit. Here we go, check it out. Not here, but in certain parts of the song, especially when there's like sound effects, you know, I might be clipping around 1 or 2 dB, so not a lot. Next up, and this is one of the secrets of getting loud masters. If you use one limiter, you're probably going to sacrifice your low end. If you use 2 limiters, you're going to help your low end. If you use 2 limiters and a clipper, you're going to be able to get your mixes really loud. So first off was the clipper. Next up is the maximizer. The maximizer, I'm using the crisp setting, threshold 3 dB. I'm bringing the ceiling down because I don't want the next limiter to get all that volume. And I'm just basically increasing, you know, do the math, 3.1 minus 0.7, I'm getting 2 point plus dB of boost on here. So let's check it out before and after. It's increasing volume, obviously, but it's only like shaving off about a dB or 2 dB at the most. That's followed by a third limiter, and this is kind of like my brick wall limiter. If I had the processing power for this video, this would be on oversampling on 2x or 4x. Settings, really important. The settings are really important. I was testing out different settings. I like to use all round, and then I'll copy that and I'll A/B it. In this case, modern felt better. And what I mean by felt better is that, all right, let me back up a little bit. When you use a limiter, listen for a couple things. First of all, turn the volume down on your monitor so you don't blow out your speakers. Turn up the limiter and listen to the low end. Are you losing definition on the low end? Is the low end starting to sound kind of like flappy, you know? Is the high end starting to sound harsh? Those are all key indicators that you're overworking your limiter. That's why I spread it out across 3 limiters, a clipper, a maximizer, and then a Pro L2. So let's listen to what limiter number 3 is doing. On the Fat Filter Pro L2, we're boosting 4 dB, and the output ceiling is set to minus 0.4. Here we go.
Tienes problema y yo no, que yo estoy pa' todo y tú no. Dime si le damos, si metemos mano, donde no chequeamos y uno. Dime cuál es la vuelta más. Actívate con la sativa, deja ya la bobería por debajo y baja con el dembow. Que tú andas sola y yo también, mira, tú estás como un tren. Déjame ponerte una de garbage. Yo sé que no soy perfecto, ay, yo sé que no soy lo que buscabas. Yo sé que no soy tu galán de novela, ni tu príncipe azul, pero
yeah, so when it comes out of the chorus and it goes into the breakdown and then it goes into the pre-chorus, the voice is just like right there in your face. The drums have clarity. You hear all the elements of the mix. There's depth. You know, it's a really good arrangement, you know, and having those 3 limiters allows me to reach the loudness target that I'm trying to achieve. In this case, minus 9 LUFS. So on my VU meter, this would be like between 0, 1, and 2. This philosophy of mixing or mastering while you mix is really important to understand, because whenever I'm working with a single and that single is going to be published, I have the mentality that I need to make the single sound as best as possible compared to any master reference out there. Therefore, I mix through the limiter. I try to achieve the best loudness and clarity by using these limiters. If I'm mixing somebody else's mastering, I'm not going to do any of this. If I'm mixing multiple songs, maybe it's an EP, I might not do this because the mastering stage is going to be separate. But when it's a single and it's going to be published and they've hired me to do it all, basically just do the song, give me a file that I can publish, it's my responsibility that the loudness is there. And that's how I was able to achieve the loudness there. So just to recap, when mixing reggaeton music or Latin urban pop, It's really important to have the drums, the bass, and the vocals sit together. That's what I like to call the core three. After that, you can bring in all the instruments and everything else. Everything's going to fall into place. When you're trying to get your track to sound loud, be sure to use a multiband limiter. In this case, I did, which is over here. This is the ML4000. This works both as an EQ and the compressor. And then I'm using 3 limiters, a clipper to catch to round off the kicks in the low end, a maximizer. In this case, I'm kind of using that as a clean limiter, and then the Pro L2, which I think is the cleanest limiter, most transparent out there. I love it. Use it on everything. And try those techniques. I'd love to hear your comments below after you try those techniques. Let me know what your results are. If you have additional questions about this song or about any other songs that you've seen here on this video, feel free to hit me up on the chat below. Again, my name is Alex with Alex Pro Mix. This channel is created for you, the viewer, the music producer, the artist, the engineer. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, leave me your comments below. Love to read them, love to respond. Till next time, I'll see you guys again real soon. Peace.